Hi guys, Dr. J here, and I wanted to take a quick video and talk about modeling and interpreting gravity data in the context of what we've been talking about with Laplace's equation, um, potential fields being modeled using Laplace's equation and Poisson's equation, and what that implies for how we would actually deal with real gravity data. Now, I'm not going to go into collecting gravity data in this lecture. We'll talk about that in another lecture. But just how to kind of think about how would we take data that we've collected at the surface or from an airborne campaign or whatever, and then turn that into useful information, useful insights about what's going on in the subsurface. How do we do that for gravity data specifically? So we've got our gravity potential definition here, and you see the potential over here, U, and then that's going to be related to the gravitational constant. And then here's our integral over a volume of density divided by R. And if we assume that the mass is a point mass, then we can just integrate this out to a single mass. So that would be for a point mass there. And this should look familiar from, college physics class. Here's the gravity potential due to a point mass. Now, the key thing here is that this is an integral, right? And so we can write integrals as sums. So that's one of the things you learn in calculus, is that sums and integrals are sort of the same. The integral is the limit of the other one as the area that you're summing becomes very small. So in other words, if we were to divide up a large mass, for example, into many, many, many small point masses, for example, and then integrate those point masses, we could write this integral as a summation over those point masses. And so the idea here is that this gravity potential is linear. We talked about that. And so that is the idea that we can sum up individual components and get the total. And so that's how this works out in this case. We could turn this integral into a summation. Now, the reason that this is really useful is because we can represent gravity anomalies, or I should say mass anomalies in the subsurface, as the sum of simpler anomalies. We can write this gravity potential as a Taylor series expansion, and there's some implications here, right? So you have a reference surface, maybe that's your ellipsoid. We can take the gravity potential at that reference surface plus some gradient with respect to the difference from that surface, right? We've got this here, that's our total potential. And if we keep those first two terms, we can look at this as the difference between the reference potential and the actual observed potential at the surface. And then we can calculate this out this way. Now, one of the implications of this is there's this geoid versus ellipsoid reference frame coordinate system thing that we've talked about before. Geoid is reference with respect to gravity. Ellipsoid is with respect to a pure geometric shape. And so we can relate these two things through what's called a disturbing potential. And that's, again, the difference between the actual geoid and the gravity potential at the ellipsoid surface. You can, for example, divide out, let me just skip up to the next slide here. You can model a gravity anomaly because we can use gravity measurements to get at a density anomaly. I should say density anomaly, not gravity anomaly. We can measure a gravity anomaly, or we can obtain a gravity anomaly for a particular density anomaly by simply subtracting out the background field. And so the whole idea here, this is what's done in typical gravity surveying, is that we're going to kind of ignore the Earth's background gravity field. We're going to remove that from the equation. And again, the idea here is that we have this sum of two gravity sources. One is the entire Earth, and we're going to assume that the Earth is sort of uniform, and we'll remove that gravity signal, or we'll model the total gravity field as that gravity signal plus some anomaly. And then we can subtract that out, and we get simply the density anomaly that's left. So we can remove the Earth's reference field and then model just the density anomaly by itself. Practically speaking, how does this work? Well, if you're doing a terrestrial gravity survey, you're going to establish a local base station. You're going to establish a local reference station, and you're going to just set that station to arbitrarily be zero gravity anomaly. And that's basically doing this exact process. So you're going to say, I've got some station here, which is hopefully not particularly sensitive to my density anomaly. not too strong of a signal from that density anomaly in my reference station. And then I'm just going to assume that that station is representative of the region, subtract that out, and then use that anomalous gravity field to get my density anomaly. Now that's maybe oversimplifying things a bit, but that's basically what you're doing. And the other, so there's kind of multiple things going on here. And this is all happening because we can model these gravity fields as a superposition of multiple density sources or multiple mass sources. So in this case, it's the mass of the Earth plus a change in mass. And sorry, there really shouldn't be a delta here. It's just the background Earth gravity plus this mass anomaly, this delta M. This delta M here is the one that's correct. And then the other kind of implication of this is that we can look at complex or large mass anomalies by divvying them up into many, many smaller anomalies. And so here we go. We have some mass anomaly. Maybe this is an ore body, something like that, and it's in the subsurface. And I've kind of removed all the background. So again, I've sort of gotten rid of the reference Earth model. And here we go. I'm taking now, I have this expression here, which is basically the distance between some particular point, and I've got this kind of highlighted as a little box here. I'm going to isolate some particular little segment, dm, with a mass anomaly dm, and there's going to be a little volume increment here, a little dv, and I'm going to calculate what is the gravity signal, what's the delta G, at this position based on this little mass anomaly at this location. And the idea here is we're going to basically divide this up. Apologize, my boxes don't line up here, but the idea is whether it's the little pink box or the larger boxes here, we're going to divide this mass anomaly up into a bunch of boxes. We're going to model the gravity contribution from the mass contribution in each one of the little boxes, and we're going to simply sum them up. So we're going to sum up all the little delta M's, and we need to use the correct R. So R is changing as we go to each little box. At this particular measurement point, there's a different R for all these little boxes, but we're going to simply calculate what that is for each one of the little boxes, sum them up, and that's how we're going to get the full mass anomaly from this source. I think we've already talked about the spherical mass anomaly. Right? It looks kind of like this. We have a sphere with some target density, and if we look at the equations, we just have our typical mass anomaly. The only difference here is that we might be off center. So instead of measuring directly above the source, we need to account for the fact that we're off center from the source. You can work that out mathematically. There's a depth term and a distance term here, and we get this. And really it's the exact same as just 1 over r. This is just a 1 over r term, but we can kind of calculate this out. And we can do this in terms of the mass anomaly by itself, or we can do it in terms of the volume. Here's the volume of a sphere, 4/3 pi r cubed, and the density anomaly. So this 4/3 pi r cubed times delta rho, that's the exact same as our delta M here. So this density anomaly plus volume or mass anomaly, either one of those, right? Gravity is sensitive to mass. And so these two are equivalent for a spherical source. This is now a fairly straightforward problem. If we know the density anomaly, we can simply plug these numbers in. We know depth of each little cell. We know the mass anomaly or the density of each little cell, whatever we might be working with, and we can simply sum up these sources. It's very straightforward to do this. There's no non-uniqueness here. Once you've got the mass of each little cell, you can simply calculate what is the gravity anomaly at that particular location X. Now, where does the problem come in? The problem comes in when we try to go the other way, right? That's always the problem. So instead of now going from density to gravity, we're going from gravity to density. And that's where we have, this is called the inverse problem. We're calculating the mass distribution from gravity. And this is, of course, classically non-unique, as we've talked about. So this is just an example from a textbook by Reynolds. This is 4 different mass anomaly types, and each one of them has a particular density anomaly, but basically each one of them gives you the exact same gravity anomaly. So there's no difference, and this is mathematically, has nothing to do with noise in the data, has nothing to do with how you collected the data or how many data points you got. This is just strictly based on the mathematics of the problem. each one of these sources, whether it's a point source, whatever that source is, I don't really know what you call these, those sources all have identical, mathematically identical gravity anomalies because of this trade-off. There's a trade-off between mass and distance, right? So as mass goes up, distance can also go up. And so then you end up getting the same number with this ratio, as the sources, because we're adding up all the mass and all the little cells. We're adding up all these little cells together. So just imagine, if we put a lot of mass in this cell versus a little in this cell, or we swap those two, and then our measurement point is at some distance away, we may not be able to tell the difference between high mass here, low mass here, and low mass here, high mass here. I may have said that backwards, but you guys get the point. Right? So you can't tell the difference in these particular distributions. And this is important. It's something that, gravity surveyors have been thinking about for a long time. So as you get deeper, these problems compound. Shallower depths tend to be shallower or more localized signals, I should say, more localized signal. So that can sometimes help. But as you try to go to deeper and deeper sources, the problem gets worse and worse and worse because, as we've talked about, the Laplacian is a smoother. It acts to smooth signals out, to smooth that source term out as we get farther and farther away. That's that 1 over r or log r, whatever, whether that's 2D or 3D. That's that decay with distance of the strength of the signal, and signals get smoothed out as you propagate away from your source. So this is why gravity inversions are so difficult. This is why you can't just collect data and assume that you're going to get the right answer, because they're non-unique. It's not just a data noise problem. It's the mathematics itself doesn't allow you to choose the correct answer. And so how do you deal with this problem? How do you deal with non-uniqueness in particular in gravity problems? There are always many different solutions that fit the observations. And there are things that we can do. So in some cases, we can do things like incorporate gravity and magnetics data together, for example. And that's what this example is showing from this particular paper. They're putting magnetics and gravity data together. They're using some kind of joint regularization. That just means joint smoothing. And that can help in some cases. Sometimes your data is very sparse. Sometimes your data is very noisy. And of course, that doesn't help. That makes the problem worse. Our data often comes in 1 and 2D profiles, or 1D profile, I should say, or a 2D surface, right? We're taking data at the surface, but the Earth and most targets of interest are 3D. The Earth is 3D. There's a 3D density distribution. So as you can imagine, if your measurements are in 1D or in 2D, you're even worse, right? You just have fewer constraints to nail down, which one of these models is happening. And especially this is the case if you only take data at the surface. If you only take data on the surface of the Earth, there's just a lot of limitations there between that distance mass trade-off. And so it's very difficult to resolve that. So how do we choose reasonable solutions? If we just have surface data, if we just have a profile, well, we can do a couple things. One thing is that we might have information for subsurface surveys, for gravity surveys. We might have information about the subsurface from geology. We can try to prefer solutions that are more smooth. We can try to prefer solutions that are more shallow or more deep, right? So we can try to, basically what we need more information. We need outside independent data. Maybe we have information at the site on what rock types we have. Maybe we have some logs. Maybe we have other geophysical techniques like magnetics, seismics, electromagnetics. We need to incorporate all this information in order to make the best possible model for what's going on in the subsurface. Okay, so we've talked about Laplace's equation. We've talked about the fact that the gravity field can be represented using Laplace's equation. And what that means, practically speaking, is that we can model gravity sources as a sum of multiple different things. We can look at the Earth's field plus an anomaly. We can look at a particular anomaly as the sum of a bunch of different small sources added up together. We have to be careful because gravity is non-unique. So whenever we're trying to figure out what actually is the density anomaly in the subsurface that's causing our data to look like that, we have to be very careful and interpret things carefully and ideally work in other data, external data, independent data to help us make those decisions. All right, great. Well, that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.